Right, in today's lecture, we're going to be starting our new topic, and that's game management. And in order to start discussing game management, we need to have a closer look at the relationships between the animals and their habitat. And the first section that we're going to cover, so we'll cover it in a lecture for today and tomorrow, is a section on population dynamics. So what is population dynamics? Well, simply, it's the characteristics of a particular animal population, and it has to do with issues such as the overall changes in the population, their carrying capacity, the reproductive strategies that animals might employ. We have already covered this. That's the R and K selected organisms, and then also in this broad topic of population dynamics, we need to have a look at how populations can be regulated, either naturally or artificially through management. Right, so let's start off with the first topic of what is a population? What are the characteristics of a population? Now, a population can be defined as the individuals of a particular species inhabiting the same area at the same time. Now, population dynamics, quite simply, is how the population changes over time due to factors such as these: population size, which is the number of individuals; the population density, so that's the number of individuals in the population in a particular area. So if you have a game reserve of 10,000 hectares, you would calculate the density to be the number of animals divided by 10,000 hectares, and that will give you a density of animals per hectare. Now, the third issue is population dispersion. So how is the population distributed spatially across the habitat? Where do they hang out? What do they do? And then fourthly is the age structure. So what is the proportion or the percentage of the number of individuals in every single age class? So juveniles, subadults, and adults. So as we heard earlier in the course, population size is influenced by two main factors, and those are births and deaths. Put more formally in a biological sense, those terms can be called natality and mortality. Natality, the number of births, is quite simply, obviously, the number of individuals that are added through reproduction, and you can calculate a birth rate from these data as the number of births per 1,000 in the population. So that's a crude way to calculate birth rate. Mortality or death rate is obviously the number of individuals that die, and the death rate can be calculated in a very similar way, the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals in the population. In terms of population density, this is the number of individuals in a population per unit area. In some species, like spring hares, for example, exist at relatively high densities, whereas other species, such as leopards, occur at relatively low densities. And this has to do with their trophic position. Spring hares are essentially strictly herbivorous, so they are herbivores, and their food is far more available and abundant than the food that something like a carnivore, like a leopard, has available to it. So it's important to remember at which level we're having a look at density, which group or trophic level are we assessing, and the herbivores will almost always be far more dense than carnivores. But the density of a population not only depends on these different trophic levels, but also the social structure of the animals, their mating relationships or reproductive strategies, and the time of year and seasonality. There might be certain times of the year, for example, that are far more beneficial for particular species and they may then increase their density at particular times of year because there is, let's say, a boom in food availability or something along those lines. So density, whilst it is influenced by trophic level, can also be affected by other factors. In terms of the way a population is distributed throughout the habitat, there are three main classifications that are used when we talk about population dispersal. First of all, individuals may be clumped together or grouped together, and this is often what we find in certain social herbivores like impala that you can see on the left-hand side. They might be quite uniformly distributed or spaced through the environment. And you should now think of what kind of animals or which species would occupy some kind of uniform environment, uniform population dispersion. And let me give you a hint. It's not going to be very easy to find an example of this kind of distribution in the terrestrial environment. But if you maybe cast your eyes to other environments, you might be able to figure out which animals live in a uniform distribution. And then the final one, which is one that we see a fair amount of in terrestrial systems that nature conservation managers will be working in, is random distribution. Individuals of a population can be randomly dispersed through the environment. An example of a plant is a dandelion, but then you have other species that you can find randomly distributed in the environment following resource availability and various other factors that affect the distribution of animals. Now, the age structure of a population can be shown graphically, and some of the classical examples include graphs that show up these three categories. The pre-reproductive, so before an animal has obtained sexual maturity, the reproductive age group, so the animals that are actively reproducing in the population, and then those that are past their prime or post-reproductives, and those are the sometimes called the senescing individuals. And this age structure is very important because if you know the age structure of a population, you can predict whether your population is growing, shrinking, or staying the same size. And here are three very classic population age structures. These are the human populations for Kenya, the United States, and Italy, and three classic shapes. You have the pyramid shape on the left, the vertical edges, and then the inverted pyramid. And then you've got your three categories, your juveniles or pre-reproductives, your reproductive age classes, and your post-reproductives. This is data that has been collected over some time from these various countries, and what you can see is you've got males and females. The males are in pink and the females are in blue. And when you have a population where the majority of the reproductives, or the majority of your population consists of reproductives, so a very strong base, as you can see on the left with Kenya, then your population is actively growing. Whereas when you have a population which is sort of starting to drift towards the larger proportions being in the upper age categories, then your population is beginning to slow. And in fact, when those numbers increase to higher levels, as in the Italy example, then your population is beginning to decrease. So very, very few pre-reproductives feeding the reproductive age class. Now, when it comes to population dynamics and carrying capacity, one of the things that we need to consider is the reproductive or biotic potential of species, which is the ability of populations of any particular species to increase naturally in size. So, biotic potential factors allow a population to increase when conditions are ideal. Okay, and this will lead to what we call exponential growth. And we can calculate that growth rate of a population, or the intrinsic growth rate of a population, and this is known as the maximum rate of population growth when there are no limiting factors like predation or other density dependent and density independent factors. So some of the factors that can contribute to the reproductive or biotic potential of a population are abiotic. Can you remember what abiotic means? Right, hopefully you've remembered, but some of the abiotic or physical factors include favorable light, temperature, and nutrients. In terms of the biotic factors, it depends on things like reproductive rate, generalized niche, the ability to move or get away from bad conditions, defense mechanisms, and being able to generally cope with adverse conditions. We also have environmental factors that affect the ability of a population to increase in size. And they can also be biotic and abiotic, so this is known as environmental resistance, and they are very, very similar factors. So the ability of populations to increase can be influenced by the environment, the very similar abiotic factors. And then when we think about the biotic factors, this can be things like a lower reproductive rate, being very specialized in what you eat, you can't move around to escape, you have inadequate defense mechanisms, and you might not be able to cope when conditions get bad. So, broadly, population growth depends on these kinds of factors. You have inputs from immigration. Remember, immigration is when animals of the species move into a particular population. There are births, but then population size, which is denoted by N in the center box, is then also negatively affected by deaths, and then emigration when animals move out. So populations can show two types of growth. First of all, they can be exponential, or what we call J-shaped in their growth, and this is really independent of population density. So what that means is that population density doesn't affect the growth rate of the population. By contrast, you can also have logistic, or what we call an S-shaped curve, where the growth is not independent of population density. In other words, as the population changes in size, we start to see it having an effect on the overall growth of the population. Now let's demonstrate those. For exponential growth, if you have unrestricted increases in populations, you start to see exponential growth. So if we think about elephants, we use elephants as our example. And if one female elephant produces 6 calves in her lifetime, and let's assume that an elephant lives for 100 years, in a population, this would equal a natural growth rate of 2%, okay? That means that if you just had one female and one male elephant that weren't affected by their population size, you could have 19 million elephants in 750 years. So clearly exponential growth rate is something that we don't see terribly often, especially in larger vertebrate species. This is what the graph would look like, and as you can see, the population size continues to increase irrespective of how that density may change over time. And this is a classic example of an exponential growth curve. Now, when it comes to carrying capacity, which is often denoted by the letter K, there's a dynamic balance between the biotic potential and environmental resistance. So there's a link when we say there's a dynamic balance. And carrying capacity, in essence, is the maximum number of individuals that a habitat can support over a period of time due to environmental resistance or sustainability. So if we have a look at some of the classic kinds of depictions of carrying capacity, what we see is that the population of a particular species, in this case it would be fish, tend to start off growing at an exponential rate. But once they get to a particular point where the environmental resistance starts to kick in with factors such as decreasing oxygen supply, lower food supply, more disease, increased predators, less space, those factors tend to maintain the population at or around a particular level, and that is what is known as carrying capacity. Now, in terms of logistic growth, because of the environmental resistance that we observe in nature, population growth tends to decrease as the density gets close to carrying capacity. So if we graph individuals versus time yields, what we see is we get a sigmoidal or S-shaped curve resulting. And this is what it would look like. If you have a look at the J curve, that would be an example of exponential growth. But what tends to happen in populations of animals that show true exponential growth is that they'll reach a point where they start to overutilize the environment, and then their populations crashes. Whereas populations that follow sigmoidal or S-shaped curves, logistic growth, as they start to approach their carrying capacity, which is the dotted line you can see there, their populations naturally begin to fluctuate. And some commentators call this population balance, where the environmental resistance maintains that ever-flowing up and down or sinusoidal growth that we see in the population. Now, in terms of population regulation, regulating a population is how the population size is controlled. And if a population tends to remain the same, then it's said to be a stable population. And the factors that control or regulate these populations can again be biotic, biological, or abiotic, physical factors. And there are a couple of types of factors. You get intrinsic factors, which operate within individuals or between organisms in the same species. You also get extrinsic factors, which are imposed from outside the population. So intrinsic is within, extrinsic is from outside. Now, there are two different types of population regulation based on these two factors, and they're classified according to the factors that control the size of the population. And we heard about these before. Those are density-dependent controlling factors and density-independent controlling factors. So density-dependent depends on the density of the population. Density-independent does not depend on the size of the population. So you should think back to some of the previous lectures and think of some examples that you can insert into your notes to provide examples for these density-dependent and density-independent factors. In terms of density-dependent factors, remember that these are normally biological, that affect the population, and we can have factors that affect or cross species boundaries, so they are interspecific interactions such as predation, competition, parasitism, commensalism, mutualism. We can also have factors that interact within the species, so intra-specific factors, and these are things like territoriality, competition within the species for things like food and mates and so on. And then you also have factors such as stress and crowding, where stress starts to shock the animals, they begin to be more susceptible to diseases and so on. Now, the characteristics of density-dependent population regulation are that they are generally, when we see populations that are regulated by density-dependent factors, they are generally what we call self-limiting. And the growth rates are usually inversely proportional to population density. So what that means is that as population density increases, so the growth rate will decrease. So that is what is provided in the example there, if the population density is high, the growth rate will be low. And this usually occurs in ecosystems where many biological interactions take place. This is often what we see in Africa, and ecosystems that are generally more stable, so undisturbed ecosystems. Now, when it comes to density independent control, we have factors that are independent of the original density of the population. A good example is fire. So a severe storm can wipe out a huge population, and so can a large fire. And these are usually, remember, density independent factors are usually physical factors such as weather or fires. And when a population is affected by density independent factors, we say that this is a resource limited form of growth. And the population size often goes over the carrying capacity before some or other physical factor then decreases the population. And growth rates, importantly for this type of population regulation, growth rates do not seem to show any trend relative to population density. And this type of regulation will often occur in ecosystems where there are very few biological interactions taking place, and where ecosystems are normally stressed by physical factors such as fire and so on. But don't forget, folks, that a population of animals or plants, in fact, is actually controlled by a combination of density dependent and density independent factors in the majority of the ecosystems of the world, particularly in savanna environments. So, let's summarize what we have just spoken about in today's lecture. Characteristics of a population include things like their overall size, the structure, their dispersal, dynamics, and carrying capacity to speak to issues of population growth rate. And population regulation is about the density dependent and density independent factors.